Hey, Mike, how's that sound? Back there? Good?
I want to call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F and House Rule 11, Clause 2 HF, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's meeting, and without objection, that is so ordered. A bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are available here in the hearing room if you would like one. Today's committee is considering one piece of legislation, and that is an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 2741, the Coast Guard Authorization Bill of 2023. And finally, I would ask unanimous consent for the committee to use as amendments roster for any items under consideration by the committee. And without objection, that is so ordered. Before I begin, I'd like to take just a moment out of, out of order. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent passing of former Chairman Bud Schuster, someone who is truly a legacy in these halls. So the impact of Chairman Schuster, the impact that he had on this committee and this chamber and our nation's infrastructure, I don't think can be overstated. When I first came to Congress, Bud had just finished his 6-year term as chairman and had already cemented his legacy as a champion of our transportation system. And I wanted to serve on this committee specifically because it was one of the most effective and bipartisan committees in Congress. And that was a reputation that was due in no small part to Chairman Bud Schuster. And over the past few decades, I believe that T&I's successes have come by following a roadmap of accomplishment that he provided. Chairman Schuster was unquestionably a fiscal conservative, but he believed in investing in infrastructure because doing so was investing in America. And there wasn't a facet of our transportation system that he didn't address and improve through his legislation or legislative leadership and unparalleled ability to build consensus and transcend partisan lines. And while he led the way on numerous bipartisan infrastructure laws, perhaps his most significant achievement was his fight to ensure that transportation trust fund dollars were invested back into the systems for which they were collected. And again, I want to extend my deepest sympathies to the Schuster family, including my very good friend and also former T&I chairman, Bill Schuster. Bud leaves behind a tremendous legacy as one of the most effective leaders in the history of this committee, and I have been honored and humbled to know him and to follow in his very large footsteps. So, I'll take it.
Mr. Chair, if I could as well, transportation means jobs. Transportation means jobs in the Pacific Northwest. It means it all over the country. And certainly for the first Chairman Schuster, transportation meant jobs for Pennsylvania and for the country. And his, as to kind of reiterate what you said a little bit, his reputation in working in a bipartisan manner with Democrats in the 90s to build the country, to build bipartisan bills on transportation and infrastructure was an important draw to me to this committee. I continue to be hopeful that we can continue that reputation in this committee as well, and it is in part because of that legacy of the Chairman Schuster. And two, I want to extend publicly on behalf of Democrats our condolences and thoughts to Bill Schuster, someone that many of us served with, and his entire family as well, and the entire Schuster family. So thanks for that opportunity, and yield back.
Thanks, Rick. All right, today we're going to be considering one matter, H.R. 2741, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2023, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the subcommittee on the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 2741 without objection. That is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. The clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741 offered by Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. This bipartisan measure authorizes funding for the Coast Guard, one of our 6 armed services, and one of which I'm particularly fond of, for the next 2 fiscal years. The men and women of the Coast Guard, they deserve the support of this committee and this Congress in their efforts to meet their challenges and their ever-growing mission set. Those missions are wide-ranging. They include ensuring the safety of maritime trade, including the supply chain crisis, enforcing United States laws at sea, protecting our nation's borders, helping counter undue Chinese influence in the Pacific, helping to develop the United States' redefined role in the rapidly changing Arctic, and countering human trafficking and the influx of illicit drugs into this country. This bill provides the Coast Guard with the authorities and the resources that it needs to carry out those missions. I commend Ranking Member Larson and Subcommittee Chairman Webster and Subcommittee Ranking Member Carbajal for working to reach a bipartisan agreement on this bill, and I would urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And with that, I would yield back and now recognize Ranking Member Larson for 5 minutes, an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to speak in support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to 2741, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2023, bipartisan legislation to reauthorize funding for the U.S. Coast Guard for fiscal years 24 and 25, and to update Coast Guard programs and policies. The bill under consideration today is a result of productive bipartisan negotiations with the chair of the full committee, Graves, the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Webster, and the ranking member, Mr. Carbajal. Each of their thoughtful contributions have improved the bill. In fact, we have worked extensively to incorporate in this legislation several bills introduced by members of the committee from both sides of the aisle. I want to thank them as well for their contributions. As we all know, the Coast Guard continues to suffer from insufficient funding. In recent years, this has resulted in a $3 billion shoreside infrastructure backlog, a lack of ice-breaking capacity in the Arctic and the Great Lakes, as well as reduced capacity across several essential missions, such as marine safety and oil spill response. H.R. 2741 works to fix these problems. The legislation provides $14.24 billion for the Coast Guard for fiscal year 24 and $14.78 billion for fiscal year 25. These increases over current levels should ensure the service has the resources needed to take care of its service members and enhance their ability to operate new assets that are expected to come online. I'm particularly pleased that we've authorized procurement, construction, and improvement accounts at $3.48 billion for both fiscal years, well above the President's budget request. This level of funding should enable the Coast Guard to maintain its ongoing capitalization programs, including making progress on building new polar security cutters and addressing the shoreside infrastructure backlog. Last Congress, we passed substantial safety measures for vessels, and this bill builds upon the work by addressing safety risk on vessels and increasing the penalties for negligent operations. The bill includes provisions to improve oil spill prevention by bolstering vessel response plans and providing the service with the tools to ensure proper response. And lastly, it includes vital provisions to address the mariner shortage. Current mariner credentialing program, which the Coast Guard oversees, is an outdated system that depends on paper applications. I think we all remember those. Processing delays impact both existing and new mariners looking to enter the industry, and I appreciate the chairman working with me to include an authorization of $11 million for a new electronic credentialing system. This, coupled with other provisions, will begin to address the mariner shortage. Closing, I want to thank the chair of the full committee, the subcommittee, and the ranking member of the subcommittee for cooperation in drafting this legislation. I look forward to working with you, and I yield back.
Thanks, Rick. Next, I'll recognize Chairman of the Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee, Mr. Webster. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm happy to support both the amendment and in the nature of a substitute and H.R. 2741, the underlying bill, which was introduced by myself along with you, along with myself and Ranking Member Larson and Subcommittee Chair Carbajal. This bill has been the bipartisan effort of every step of the way. Both sides of the aisle came together to craft legislation that recognizes the importance work of the Coast Guard does to protect waters, interdiction of drugs, stop human trafficking, and promote maritime safety. I'm also proud that we're able to include priorities suggested by our colleagues in this bill. This legislation authorizes funding for the Coast Guard through fiscal year 2025 and makes critical investments to enable the service to meet their growing mission demands. Despite the Biden administration's failure to seek appropriate investments needed to maintain the Coast Guard's mission capabilities, this bill authorizes more than $10 billion for the operations and support account and nearly $3.5 billion for the procurement, construction, and improvement account for fiscal year 2024. The legislation authorizes 4 additional fast response cutters, a commercially available icebreaker, and additional heavy lift aircraft, helicopters, and vessels that will support the Coast Guard's mission. We also hope to make a dent in addressing the Coast Guard's crumbling shoreside infrastructure, providing $400 million for shoreside facilities, as well as improvements at the Coast Guard's training center in Cape May, New Jersey, and several other facilities. This bill will help the Coast Guard address its recurring and retention challenges and will boost the pool of qualified United States merchant marines by reducing burdensome barriers and requirements for those seeking a seagoing career. I'm also pleased that the legislation includes language to strengthen the Coast Guard's ability to counter the cyber threats that jeopardize the safety of our supply chain. I also wish to note that my reservations with the inclusion of changes to foreign manning requirements for certain vessels operating on the outer continental shelf. I look forward to working with my colleagues in industry on this issue to ensure our nation's energy independence. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your work on the legislation, along with Ranking Member Larson and Subcommittee Ranking Member Carbajal. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. And now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Carbajal for 5 minutes. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to express my support for H.R. 2741, as well as the inclusive and bipartisan process we went through to get here. This bill will reauthorize, enhance, and support the critical missions of the U.S. Coast Guard. I am grateful for the leadership of Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and Chairman Webster for working together to craft this bipartisan agreement that will help save lives, protect our maritime environment, and support our coasties. Day in and day out, the Coast Guard illustrates its resourcefulness. Coasties regularly operate at the juncture of safety and natural security, law enforcement, transportation, and environmental protection. They respond during times of crisis without thinking twice. These women and men are resourceful, but they need our support. The increased reauthorization in today's bill signals our confidence in the excellence of the Coast Guard and begins funding the service to successfully complete each of its diverse missions. I am proud that the bill includes several provisions to address the shortage of U.S. merchant mariners. If we want to ensure a vibrant pool of merchant mariners, which is necessary for national and economic security, we must remove barriers to entering industry and ensuring steady long-term employment opportunities. This bill does both. Additionally, this bill builds on the last 2 Coast Guard authorizations by ensuring vessel safety. It provides and clarifies the authority of the Coast Guards to protect the safety of life at sea. It also ensures that Coast Guard has the information it needs to address new vessel technologies and increase traffic in the Arctic. With this bill, we can ensure the Coast Guard has the resources it needs to respond to emergencies on the water and, through better recruiting, continue to promote diversity within the U.S. Coast Guard to ensure it is a reflection of our nation. I am proud to have worked on this bill, and I look forward to working to ensure that it becomes law. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal. Now we're going to move on to consideration of amendments. And I now recognize myself for a manager's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute that I have at the desk. Please designate the amendment.
Manager's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Graves of Missouri, 001.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the manager's amendment. I obviously support the manager's amendment and appreciate the work of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle when it comes to this. I'm glad we were able to incorporate several members' amendments into the manager's package. Among its provisions, the amendment provides additional resources for the Coast Guard's Great Lakes icebreaker and contains reporting requirements for the Coast Guard's Unmanned Systems Capability Office, as well as the service's drug and human trafficking interdiction efforts in the Caribbean. The amendment also includes language to improve the safety of our ports. This is something that, it obviously cleans up a lot of amendments, and so with that, I will yield back. And do any other members wish to be recognized? Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chair, for offering the manager's amendment. I'm pleased to speak in support of it. This amendment includes several bipartisan requests and technical fixes that have been agreed to by the chair of the full and subcommittee, as well as ranking member Carbajal and myself. Included in the amendment are provisions that support and strengthen the Coast Guard with practical common sense solutions. It includes various reporting requirements that provide helpful data to Congress, such as Ms. Gonzalez-Colon's amendment to provide an overview of maritime domain awareness in Puerto Rico and gaps in the Coast Guard's capability to respond to drug and human smuggling. Also help the Coast Guard prepare for new vessel technology by requiring reporting on how they intend to carry out recommendations of their recent unmanned systems strategies. In closing, I want to thank the chairs of the full and subcommittee and ranking member Carbajal for their work to include member priorities and reiterate my strong support for the manager's amendment. With that, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the manager's amendment? Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm pleased that this bipartisan manager's amendment provides provisions offered by my colleagues that provide additional authorities and resources necessary for the Coast Guard to carry out its missions. I am pleased that the amendment mandates completion of the Coast Guard's long-delayed Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study. With that, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Let's see.
Class withdrew.
Okay.
So we're going to this one. It's a little out of order.
All right. Mr. Schulten, for what purpose does Mr. Schulten seek recognition?
Skolton.
Skolten?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Skolten.
No problem.
I'm still getting to know everybody. I'm struggling on my side of the aisle, let alone your side of the aisle.
No problem at all, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you, Mr. Chair. During the government shutdown in early 2019,
Let him designate.
oh, sorry, I thought I heard it. Apologies.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mrs. Skolten, number 010.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Ms. Skolten, you're recognized for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the government shutdown of 2019, the United States Coast Guard was the only branch of the U.S. Armed Forces not compensated while on duty. This lasted over 35 days, over a month, without the Coast Guard and their families receiving a paycheck. And it marked the first time in history that any member of the U.S. Armed Forces were not paid during a lapse in appropriations. For 35 days, 41,000 active duty Coast Guard members worked without pay, including 360 who were deployed to the Arabian Gulf, in addition to 6,200 reservists and 8,500 civilian personnel. There were heartbreaking stories of service members holding garage sales to make ends meet. At my local station in Grand Haven, Coast Guardsmen and women were reliant on community generosity to get by. Many of the station's 18, 19, and 20-year-olds didn't have enough emergency savings to cover even 1 month of expenses. Their heightened anxiety and stress created by this disruption in pay increased risk for Coast Guard members during already dangerous missions. For 35 days, almost 1,000 families did not receive child care subsidies necessary to allow them to care for their children while meeting mission demands. Death benefits were not paid to survivors of Coast Guard members who died while on active duty, and housing leases for personnel living in government-leased housing were not paid. Nor was this impact only felt by the service members themselves. Operational integrity suffered significantly during this period. Issuance of merchant mariner documents and licenses were ceased. Vessel documentation and inspections of new commercial vessel construction was stopped, and recreational boating safety and bridge administration activities were halted. We must not let this happen again. Last week, with my co-lead, Rep. Gonzalez Colon, I introduced the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act of 2023. And today, I offer this bill as an amendment to the underlying bill. Previously introduced by former Chair DeFazio during the 2019 shutdown, this language would ensure that the Coast Guard continues to be paid just as other branches of the military are paid in the event of a shutdown. Protecting our nation both at home, on our coasts, and overseas, away from our families, is a critical mission. Coast Guard members need to know that they have financial security. 2/3 of service members report that the security and stability of a job had a great or very great influence on their decision to join the military. During a time when recruitment is at an all-time low for Coast Guard, we need to ensure that we are doing all we can to make sure they are placed on a level playing field. I recognize the chairman's concerns about including this in the underlying legislation today. Given these concerns, I would be willing to withdraw the amendment if a commitment from the chairman to work together to address this issue, but I'd like to hear from my other colleagues as well.
So I was hoping that Jennifer would be here to speak on it, and maybe some others want to speak, and she'll get here. Thanks, Hillary, for your statement. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a former service member myself, I know how hard our military men and women work to serve our country. The long hours, grueling physical exertion, and distance from friends and family are all part of the job. Our Coast Guard is no different. Coast Guard service members work incredibly hard to maintain a safe and navigable maritime transportation system. Their presence along our coasts and inland waterways is crucial for our safety. Coast Guard service members deserve to have equal pay to any other branch of the military. Unfortunately, currently, that is not the case. Coasties are forced to go without pay in the event of a lapse in appropriations. Despite their critical role in maintaining security of life at sea, this doable standard should be corrected so that coasties don't have to worry when they'll get their next paycheck, or if they'll need to take a second job to keep food on the table for their families. Despite the importance of this issue, regrettably, I am unable to support this amendment at this time due to the Big Four requirement agreement. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, agree with my colleague essentially and say what a terrible time that was. Now, as you know, I have the training center in my district. I have the only training center in the country, and we are a Coast Guard community. So the people love the Coast Guard where I live. It literally is a very important part of our school system, of our community, of everything that happens there. And to see them have to go through that because of the way the system is formed in paying the Coast Guard, different than the rest of the military, obviously, was very harsh. So if this is
not going to be corrected now. I would hope to work with the chairman along with you to see if we can, do something here to really make this equitable, because it isn't right. These are good men and women that deserve to get paid if something terrible like this happens, and it was a very, very bad time. I mean, it made me sad to see that we were literally doing fundraisers and accumulating food and all kinds of, diapers and all the things that young families need. And that's not how you really perceive your military, and it's not how they should be treated. So thank you for doing this. I'd like to join along with you, work with the chairman, and see if we can, work through this at some point.
Thank you.
Ms. Bellatola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I am in strong support of this amendment. I'm a little disappointed it'll be withdrawn, but I completely understand. I've signed on as a co-sponsor to the Coast Guard Pay Parity Act, and one way or another, I hope that this language makes its way onto the president's desk. Of course, everybody knows the U.S. Coast Guard plays an essential role in protecting national security every single day. In Alaska, we've had foreign adversaries doing drills in our waters in Alaska, and the only deterrent is the presence of the U.S. Coast Guard. And whether it's search and rescue, protecting power in the Arctic, drug interdiction, or immigration enforcement from Florida all the way up to Alaska, we really rely on the Coast Guard to be on the front lines of our maritime borders, and we're a better and safer nation because of the Coast Guard. I do think it is very unfair that if Congress can't get its business done, if the Senate and the House and the President are not in agreement and we wind up in a federal shutdown, that our Coast Guardsmen are the people who suffer the most for that. I'm very grateful for the work of the men and women in the Coast Guard for keeping Americans safe. Alaska has some of the most inhospitable weather conditions on Earth and about half of the United States coastline, and the Coast Guard plays a huge role in search and rescue and just the way of Alaskan life. So I am in full support of the intent of this amendment and the intent of the legislation, and I look forward to working on the legislation as it moves forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Davids?
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I would also like to echo the support for these specific provisions in this amendment because of the particular and special mission types that the Coast Guard performs for our country, recognizing that they have not just search and rescue missions, but so many other things that are vital to our nation's national security, and would look forward to continuing to work in a bipartisan way on this committee with Congresswoman Skolten and others to ensure that the Coast Guard has pay parity alongside the rest of our armed forces. I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none. Hillary and I will work with you and with Jennifer for sure, who's a co-sponsor as well, and on this, be happy to try to get something worked out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With commitment to work together on this issue, I respectfully withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. Just for everybody's information, too, Mr. Auchincloss withdrew some amendments, so some of these are out of order as we move forward. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Perry. Wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk, number 104.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Perry, number 104.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While the Jones Act and the merits of its protectionist policies are incredibly contentious, This amendment does not seek to relitigate the past century of Jones Act restrictions. Instead, this amendment simply creates an exemption for ships carrying liquefied natural gas, a sector of the market that the maritime industry refuses to serve despite its complete insulation from foreign competition, which harms Americans and literally empowers our enemies. This amendment still applies Jones Act restrictions to Russian and Chinese-owned, flagged, and crewed ships. While there have been some improvements in the industry, the few Jones Act compliance LNG ships that have been produced are refueling ships. They are not transport ships, which makes a big difference. Anyone who conflates the two is purposefully misleading the American people to protect the shipbuilding industry, union leadership, our foreign adversaries, and at their constituents' expense. The failure to produce LNG transport ships, despite over a decade of record-high natural gas production in the United States, is a damning indictment of the idea that protection from competition somehow incentivizes shipbuilding. Instead, the lack of competition has created a situation where there is a $500 million differential between a Jones Act-compliant ocean-going LNG carrier and a foreign ship. $500 million extra cost because of this policy. The truth is, the failure of the shipbuilding industry to meet this moment and produce affordable ships is the reason that American cities, territories, and states are unable to consume American LNG and instead are forced to accept foreign natural gas from Russia. That's unbelievable. Puerto Rico did it in February of 2022, right as Vladimir Putin was invading Ukraine. This completely undermines our economic security and our national security, destroying the very basis for the Jones Act, as it benefits our enemies directly at the expense of the American natural gas producers and our very consumers that we take an oath to defend and protect, along with the Constitution. While protecting American jobs is a venerable goal, and we all support that, the failure of the industry to supply the industry with ships to meet the demand kills Pennsylvania jobs and jobs in your very districts. It empowers and enriches Vladimir Putin, threatens the reliability of our electric grid, and degrades the American economy directly. I ask for support of the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Just noting for members, if you want to oppose Vladimir Putin, please continue to vote for Ukraine supplementals to push back against the unjustified Ukrainian invasion. This amendment would exempt liquefied natural gas vessels from the requirements of the Jones Act. In doing so, the amendment allows vessels built anywhere in the world, registered anywhere in the world, crewed by anyone in the world to operate, free from American laws, including labor and environmental laws in our ports, along our coasts, and our inland river systems. If that's not enough, this amendment would directly strip employment from hardworking middle-class American mariners, the same mariners who provide the strategic sea lift capacity of our military overseas in times of peace and in war. And finally, I would note that there's the exemption exempting vessels transporting LNG for flagged or for crewed. This would as a result, this would also then allow crews or flagged vessels from a variety of countries to operate, including North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Iraq, Libya, UAE, Yemen, Egypt, Chad, Bangladesh, Algeria. I'll let any member decide if they support or oppose any of those countries allowing their vessels or their crews to operate in U.S. waters. But that is what the practical impact of this amendment would be. And so for a variety of reasons, I'd ask members to oppose this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, we got close to getting an agreement on this, and unfortunately, we weren't able to. I'm going to have to oppose the amendment. Are there any other amendments to the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none. All
Questions on the amendment?
Question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
It appears that the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote on the amendment as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Yeah, the amendment will be, or at least the vote will be postponed. We do have a conflict with the Homeland Security Committee, so when we do roll, we will roll all of the votes today. We'll take a short recess to get our members back before we take the votes on any, or at least when we execute any recorded votes. So, moving forward. Mr. Van Drew, you have an amendment?
I do have an amendment at the desk, yes, sir.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Van Drew, number 027.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. Mr. Van Drew, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I'd like to thank Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson for working with me to include language in the manager's amendment that directs the U.S. Coast Guard to implement a final rule on the Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study. This study is critical to determine what navigation features are needed to ensure safe maritime transit on the Atlantic coast. There is a decade-long tradition of furthering port access studies through congressional authorization, and I, for one, appreciate the bipartisanship. My amendment highlights the fact that the Coast Guard's preliminary safety recommendations are in conflict with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's offshore wind energy lease areas. In 2015, BOEM established and auctioned arbitrary offshore wind lease areas without due process. The agency has now spent 8 years working backwards to justify the projects. BOEM established and sold the leases before checking that they were safe. Now, BOEM's own analysis states that their projects will have a, quote, major, end quote, impact that will, quote, increase the risk of collision, end quote, and could, and again, quote, result in personal injury or loss of life. Under current law, it does not matter what safety recommendations the Coast Guard makes in these established wind lease areas. That's because the law gives leaseholders paramount rights over any navigation safety purposes. BOEM's strategy was clearly to rush a lease auction, gain regulatory protection. They then used that regulatory protection to steamroll other federal maritime authorities as they seek to completely transform the eastern seaboard. I would urge the U.S. Coast Guard to take a more active role in the offshore wind energy leasing process, because right now they're letting BOEM completely set the terms for the Atlantic coast, and maritime safety is not being considered as a major factor. It is the United States Coast Guard's and this committee's responsibility to ensure maritime safety in the United States of America. There is a role for this committee to play in the offshore wind conversation. Otherwise, we will have essentially ceded this committee's jurisdiction on maritime safety to the congressional committees who oversee BOEM. Understanding that the committee will not adopt this amendment, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my amendment from consideration. However, I look forward with working with you, the ranking member, and I do appreciate my other amendment being included in the managers. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew. Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself. Unfortunately, and the fact of the matter is, I do appreciate the gentleman's frustration on this issue, and I commit to, obviously, to working with you, and I appreciate the withdrawal of the amendment. But be happy to work with you. All right. Mr. Perry? Where'd Scott go? Please designate the amendment. It's 114, I believe.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Perry, number 114.
So without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. And Mr. Perry, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply clarifies that the Coast Guard may not operate, enter into, or renew a contract that includes a preference for the use of carbon-neutral, carbon-free, and net-zero construction materials. The Biden administration has committed to a government-wide effort to, quote, unquote, buy clean, including through construction materials. However, despite GSA issuing the first nationwide green concrete and asphalt standards according to their 2022 sustainability plan, environmentally preferable paving has been merely cost neutral at the initial 6 job sites. Furthermore, it's unclear whether the technical changes in concrete mixtures, in other words, replacing Portland cement with things like fly ash and even hemp, are durable enough in industrial construction. I know in Pennsylvania, where it's been used, it has not worked and they've had to tear it out. Even the loudest voices pushing these technologies worldwide acknowledge the inability for the free market to adopt these technologies on its own. According to a March 2023 World Economic Forum report, obstacles to using green construction materials at scale include non-compliance with industry standards and codes, lack of demand from developers, governments, and corporations, and most importantly, cost of material and labor, which the report acknowledges are prohibitively burdensome. To quote this report again, the World Economic Forum says it's a chicken and egg situation if firms and their clients, as well as policymakers, don't prioritize the use of low-carbon concrete in buildings and infrastructure projects. Many manufacturers will be loath to allocate capital expenditures for material production. And until low-carbon cement and concrete producers are produced at a greater scale, their availability and cost will be a concern for the industry. It's a whole lot of words to say this technology is unlikely to be used in the absence of government subsidy, favoritism, and mandate. Yet the Inflation Reduction Act appropriated over $2 billion to the GSA for the use of low-carbon materials. This is simply a waste of taxpayer money all around. If green construction materials somehow become more cost-effective than traditional building materials, they'll be used in private and public projects alike. But until that happens, though I know this is decades late for the left's, let's not continue to enact government cronyism on behalf of ineffective and expensive technology. Again, this amendment seeks to forestall, at least at the Coast Guard, the forced adoption of these Green New Deal technologies, which we actually have no empirical proof work. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption. I yield the balance.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I rise in opposition to this amendment. It would prohibit the Coast Guard from prioritizing carbon-neutral, carbon-free, and net-zero construction materials. However, this attempt at blocking the Coast Guard from reducing emissions fails to define carbon-neutral, carbon-free, and net-zero construction materials. Provision could be read to restrict the Coast Guard from using wood when constructing a building. It just isn't a well-written amendment, does not provide direction or specifics about how it would be implemented. What this provision really does is tie the service's hands. It will cause major disruptions to existing and future acquisitions and projects. We don't know what construction materials will exist in the future, so why are we seeking to fix a problem that does not exist? So I would ask the committee to vote no on this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I have to oppose the amendment. And with that, we will go ahead and, are there any other amendments to the amendment? Is there any amendment to the amendment? And seeing none, we'll go ahead with the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
It appears that the nays have it. The nays do have it. With that, the amendment is not agreed to. We now move on to Mr. Perry, number 121. You recognize for 5 minutes, or, well,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply strikes.
go ahead and call it up and.
Oh, all right, Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment at the desk.
Designated, please.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Perry, number 121.
Without objection, we'll consider the amendment as read. Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply strikes Section 336 of the ANS. The underlying provision applies manning, flagging, and crewing requirements to foreign vessels operating on the outer continental shelf. Proponents of this provision cloak themselves in the veil of national security and creating American jobs. Unfortunately, this provision actually threatens both. In fact, under this provision, so long as a ship is owned, crewed, and flagged by Chinese or Russians, they can operate on the outer continental shelf. That's right. Our worst enemies can continue to operate under this provision so long as they own, crew, and flag the ship. This clearly does not improve our national security, and any argument to that effect is an obfuscation of the truth. While there is a hypothetical situation where this creates a few jobs in the long term, the absolute, for sure, immediate impact on jobs will be devastating, and the net results will be a loss of American jobs. The truth is, the supporters of this underlying provision are creating yet another layer of protectionism in our maritime laws as a handout to special interest without regard to the consequences of those actions. Well, here are the consequences. A halt to offshore energy projects currently under construction and killing the potential for further or future projects, an estimated $27 billion in Gulf oil and gas development projects killed literally, virtually, really overnight. For every oil rig that is not created because of this misguided attempt to provide handouts to special interests, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of downstream and direct maritime jobs lost. Through 2030, it is estimated that this provision will reduce annual investment by more than $15 billion, reduce supported employment by 137,000 jobs, reduce annual GDP by $12.6 billion, and reduce U.S. oil production by 600,000 barrels per day. That's not my projections. I didn't come up with that. Killing jobs, reducing economic output, and increasing reliance on foreign oil producers. Doesn't sound like it's good for American jobs, the maritime industry, or our national security, yet that's what these provisions will do if we allow them to continue. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield the balance.
Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Arise in opposition to this amendment. A little while later, we'll have an amendment that strikes this section, but adds a different approach to this particular issue, and I'm going to encourage support of that amendment. But just striking this amendment without recognizing the value of alternative energy, renewables, is, I think, not the actions that we should be taking. We're entering an exciting time for renewable energy and for offshore wind, which has great potential overall. The administration has pledged to increase the U.S. use of offshore wind energy with a goal of doubling by 2030 to 30 gigawatts, an effort I wholeheartedly support, an effort that is going to be reflected possibly off the coast of the state of Washington and Oregon in the future. According to the Global Wind Energy Council, the global wind energy industry grew by more than 53% from 2019 to 2020, and investment in offshore wind totaled $303 billion in 2020. Since the passage of the BIL and the IRA, billions of federal grant and tax credit dollars have been dedicated to this. With this growth and investment, we have to ensure energy development in the U.S. waters exists. So this amendment strikes Section 336 of the Coast Guard Authorization Act, which ensures that all vessels operating in U.S. territorial waters are crewed by Americans or crew of the nation of which the vessel is flagged. Now, as I said, a little while later we'll have an amendment that strikes this section, but does not leave us hanging with nothing. It is Amendment Aachen Clause 15, and I would encourage folks to take a look at that. And that's how we should address this particular issue. But if we truly want to secure energy independence, we have to ensure that we have American workers necessary to install and maintain offshore infrastructure And this particular amendment does nothing to continue to help us do that. And so because of that, I would urge an opposition to this amendment. And I yield back.
Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the ranking member for his comments, and I certainly appreciate the amendment from my friend from Pennsylvania. Mr. Chairman, I want to be really clear on this. Myself, Congressman Steve Scalise, we represent the coastal area that produces energy, produces offshore energy. You can take all of the offshore hydrocarbon production that happens in the United States, Alaska, California, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, 6 states. You can take those other 5 states, the non-Louisiana states, you can take all their offshore production in federal waters, you can multiply times 4, and we still have more. So said another way, we represent more offshore energy production in federal waters than any other state by multiples. This affects our state. We represent both the energy producers and workers, and we represent the maritime industry. This amendment is a solution in search of a problem. I want to be clear. Congressman Scalise and I are united in this. This is a solution in search of a problem. The way that we transport LNG in the United States is through pipes. Excuse me, not LNG. Natural gas is through pipes. That's the safest way of doing it. It's lower energy, it's lower emissions, it's lower cost, and it's certainly safer. National Research Council did a study. Anybody wants to argue, that's fine. You can argue with National Research Council. What this amendment does is it tries to say that liquefied natural gas vessels get an exemption. And it says that they don't have to comply with U.S.-built, U.S.-crewed, U.S.-flagged rules. This isn't an issue. It's not an issue. LNG is being exported, all right? To be exported, you do not have to be a U.S. crewed, flagged, or built vessel. Google it, look it up yourself. This is a amendment. This is a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist. I'm really not even sure what this is trying to tackle. This committee has been rock solid in our Jones Act support historically, recognizing the importance of the United States maintaining its ability to have a defense industrial base, to be able to build ships. Anybody thinks I'm crazy, look exactly what's happening with supply chain issues in Ukraine right now. Mr. Chairman, I strongly object to this amendment. I think that it is misguided. I don't think that it understands energy issues, and I'm going to say one last time. As a representative of coastal Louisiana, representative of more energy production than anyone else in this Congress by multiples, together with Congressman Steve Scalise, we oppose this amendment. We urge that it be rejected and yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you. I certainly agree with Mr. Graves on this matter. However, I think the Perry Amendment's dealing with a slightly different issue. That issue has to do with how we supply the vessels for the offshore energy systems, both oil, gas, and offshore wind energy. The language of the bill that would be removed by this amendment by Mr. Perry would remove specific requirements that the vessels that are providing the support for those industries be manned by individuals that are of the same nationality as the ownership of the vessel itself. In addition, that those crew members be properly vetted for national security reasons, specifically the Transportation Worker Identification Credential, known as the TWIC card, and also that the U.S. Coast Guard provide scrutiny as to the actual ownership and safety of the vessel itself. So the bill itself provides a mechanism in which we have assurance that the vessels operating in these offshore energy industries, both oil, petroleum, and wind, be properly manned and properly certified for safety. And that the visas that are routinely given to the people that are working on these ships be regulated, limited. Right now, a ship owner can go out and request hundreds of visas, even though there would be several times more visas given than could possibly be used on that particular ship. So the underlying bill itself provides a protection of security to this nation as well as the industry and the workers itself. And therefore, the amendment by Mr. Perry eliminating Section 336 is inappropriate. And I would oppose the proposed amendment by Mr. Perry.
Mr. Boston. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an effort to correct the record, I would like to yield Mr. Graves my time.
Mr. Chairman, I gave a phenomenal rebuttal to the wrong amendment. I mistakenly believe.
Move to strike.
As you know, I was coming here from another meeting, and I thought we were going in order. But as I should have recognized, there's nothing in order about Mr. Perry. So, of course, I mean that in jest. I know, he's just trying to save the American people. No, Mr. Perry's a good friend of mine, but on this one we disagree. So let me rewind and get Rev back up here and what we're talking about. So I'm going to say it again. I appreciate Mr. Perry's amendment. He is a friend of mine, and I have a lot of respect for him. I'll mention what I said before. We represent more of this industry than anybody else, and we are united and we are opposed to this amendment. Last Congress, we did it the opposite way. We actually included this provision in the bill by amendment, all right? We took this provision, we included it in the bill by amendment, and there were objections last Congress. There were objections, but I want to tell you what the vote was when we took the vote on this amendment. The vote was 59 people of this committee saying, yes, we want this in the bill, and 2 opposed. 2 opposed. So this amendment, this provision that's in the base text of the bill, enjoys broad bipartisan support. What it does is it simply tries to begin, and I want to emphasize, begin leveling the playing field between offshore vessels, foreign vessels and vessels that are built, crewed, and flagged in the United States, all right? So all we're doing, and we've heard people talk about this new energy transition and how it's gonna be phenomenal for US workers and US jobs, yet what do? We try and create a loophole, we try and create an unfair advantage for foreign vessels. Let me explain this very simply. If Mr. Perry and I were going to race across the room and we're going to say, whoever gets to the other side, you get $1 million. Except for Mr. Perry, you get to start halfway across. That's what this does. It doesn't, he's better and faster. That's what he says. That's what this does. Foreign vessels, you don't have to comply with any of the safety standards, the manning standards. You can have people speaking 12 different languages on boats. This ensures that we begin, and I'm going to say it again, begin, because under this amendment or under this base text, foreign vessels still have a competitive advantage over those in the United States. What the base text does is it requires crazy things like ensuring they get a safety inspection. It requires things like making sure that the crew on the vessel are actually of the same nation of the flag of the vessel. It ensures that we have a more level playing field. I'm going to say it again. It still provides a benefit or an advantage to foreign vessels, but it tries to give American workers, American vessels, a level playing field or some ability to try to compete. If this industry is going to be an American industry, if we're going to have American jobs, then we need to make sure we're giving American workers a fair shot at this. We have watched over and over and over again where we've given gifts to other countries, whether it's playing into the hands of China for mineral resources, whether it's becoming more dependent upon Russian oil, whether it's negotiating with Venezuela or Iran. We can't do this. We have American resources. So people are going to try and come out and say, oh, this is going to kill domestic industry. Bull. Do you really think the person that represents this area is going to go out and say, yeah, I want our people to not have jobs? How long would I have this job? It's simply not true. I want to say it again. Congressman Scalise, myself, our delegation, we are supportive of this, and we're the ones who represent this industry. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I want to remind the committee members last year, as folks were raising opposition and raising issues, I offered over and over and over and over again to sit down and negotiate. Folks said, oh, we've got projects in the pipeline, you're going to kill them. So that's fine. Let's talk about a grandfather. They said, oh, it's going to take us time to transition and train workers. That's fine. Let's talk about the right investments that are needed for training centers to get people the right experience. And we got crickets. I have no sympathy whatsoever for the people on the other side of this issue if they're refusing to sit down and negotiate and try and address their concerns. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I want to thank my friend from Illinois for yielding. I apologize for wasting the committee's time earlier on my debate of the wrong amendment, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chair, I just want to yield the gentleman from Louisiana 20 seconds to check his notes to be sure that, in fact, that was the right speech on the right amendment. One more time.
I got to be honest, I have no idea.
Your staff was trying to get your attention, but
I yield
Did I
back.
get it right or no?
I yield back.
Mr. Stauber.
God, darn. Was that the right one?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I just appreciate the comments here. I stand in opposition to my good friend and colleague's amendment. No company will ever pay more for service than they are required. If we allow foreign vessels to employ foreign mariners or allow developers to charter cheap foreign vessels, they will do so even if there are 1 million American jobs available. When someone tells you it's not about the money, it's about the money. This issue is about developers wanting to save money by employing cheap foreign crews in America. In no other industry would we allow a company to import foreign labor at foreign prices to do a job American workers can do. We shouldn't be allowing this in our sovereign waters. Congress must not pick winners and losers. When we all allow one set of vessels to operate by one set of crewing laws, while allowing foreign vessels owners to utilize a different and lower set of crewing laws, is picking the foreign vessels as winners. I refuse to do that. We have the mariners to meet the needs of this legislation today. The best way to grow the maritime industry for tomorrow's needs is to ensure there are mariner jobs available to Americans. This is the #1 recommendation of Murad report on growing the maritime workforce. This is not allowing us to play on a level playing field. We must protect the American workers, and I stand opposed to this amendment, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on Mr. Perry, amendment number 121. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. It appears that the nays have it. A recorded vote has been requested, and pursuant to Section 6F, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Thank you, Mr. Perry. All right. We'll move on to Perry, number 117. Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Perry, number 117.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Last one, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. For the past several years, Democrats and left-leaning special interest groups have stubbornly crusaded against gas-powered vehicles and attempted to force the American people and federal government to adopt alternative fuel-powered vehicles, including electric vehicles. They put these ambitions on full display in the doomed fiscal year 2022 House appropriations bills by earmarking hundreds of millions of dollars to electrify the federal fleet, seemingly oblivious to the numerous drawbacks of EVs compared to the internal combustion engine vehicle. How would a Department of Interior-owned electric pickup truck refill miles from a charging station? Or should the Postal Service be using EVs which weigh significantly more than a comparable gas-powered vehicle and would tear up our nation's roads at an even faster rate? Or will a small-town fire department like the one in Hershey, Pennsylvania, that just had to deal with one of these things that burned up in the house, have the resources necessary to extinguish a lithium-ion electric vehicle fire? Unfortunately, instead of reevaluating their electrification push considering these challenges, Democrats want to go even further and procure electrical tactical vehicles for the military. In 2019, the GAO found that the Coast Guard maintenance backlog totals at least $2.6 billion. This must be addressed before we throw money away at the green dystopian future envisioned by the majority. Moreover, the electrification push empowers, enriches, and emboldens our enemies in Beijing and Moscow as they control the very component mineral supply chains needed to produce EVs. This amendment ensures the Coast Guard does not procure unnecessary, often untested EV and EV infrastructure projects and empower, embolden, and enrich our enemies. I don't mind if they do it if the market provides for it, but forcing them to do it is absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd, and it's a waste of the American taxpayer dollar. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption. I yield the balance.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment seeks to prohibit the Coast Guard from procuring electric vehicles and related infrastructure, which would tie the hands of the Coast Guard in carrying out their missions. None of the provisions in H.R. 2741 focus on electric vehicles and related infrastructure, nor do they provide funding for either of these purposes. However, this year the Coast Guard released their first ever climate framework that focuses on preparedness, on resilience, and on collaboration with partners to best position the Coast Guard for the inevitable challenges that climate change presents. This framework includes building climate resiliency into the Coast Guard workforce, into its infrastructure, and into its assets, as well as planning for and responding to more frequent weather emergencies. And given the Coast Guard's critical role in life-saving missions and their need to position themselves to best carry out their mission, this amendment would hinder that goal, just taking away one more tool from the Coast Guard. Regardless, responding to climate change and reducing emissions are not the only reasons the Coast Guard would potentially want to procure electric vehicles. Prohibiting the procurement of EVs without fully examining the impact of future needs of the Coast Guard is short-sighted and could have negative implications for the service. Just don't tie the Coast Guard's hands. That's all we're asking, and I urge no on this amendment.
Do any other members, Mr. Van Droop?
I think the intent of this bill, and thank you, Chairman, I think the intent of this bill is good, but I also think we have to realize, I think the wording is somewhat, at least to me, questionable. I don't think the Coast Guard should be forced to actually buy electric vehicles. There could be situations where an electric vehicle would be better for the needs that they have at a particular time. So if this said, if this amendment said that the Coast Guard cannot be forced to do so, I would actually support it, because all the things that Mr. Perry said, the trace minerals we're going to rely on, giving more power to China, all the issues that come up with this and still not really quite ready. I believe all those issues are true. But also what was said by our ranking member, I think has some real truth to it as well, in that it's not the only reason they might get an electric vehicle. What I would like to see is to get the best vehicle for the best purpose, for the best buck. And this doesn't necessarily do that. This just completely says that you can't ever use electric vehicles, and that to me is the other extreme of it. So that I don't support. Mr. Perry, if you do something that says they can't be forced to use electric vehicles or even pay more or overly incentivize, that would be something I would think about. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on Mr. Perry, amendment number 117. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. The nays do have it. The amendment is not agreed to. All right. Mr. Babin, you have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment. It's Babin number 10.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Babin, number 010.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. Mr. Babin?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for your work on this important legislation. I offer this amendment today to protect pilots and waterway operators from being inadvertently swept up in Coast Guard rulemaking that was not intended to target them. As a part of the 2022 Coast Guard reauthorization bill, Congress passed sweeping language requiring any ocean-going non-passenger vessel with overnight accommodations for 10 or more individuals to install video and audio surveillance equipment aboard that vessel. The legislation also included language requiring vessel owners to retain records of audio and video surveillance for at least 1 year after the footage was obtained. Purchasing security cameras, audio surveillance equipment, as well as data storage is a serious cost. And while I understand some of the larger carriers covered by this language may be able to cover these costs, they can be a serious financial burden on a smaller tugboat, towboat, or barge operator. With the 10-plus crew size covered by that language, smaller carriers would be subject to the same requirements as large offshore carriers. I do not believe that this was the intent of last year's language. And while we work to protect men and women at sea, we must be sure that our actions are focused on operations where problems are occurring. We've got to be data-driven and must be sure that we aren't inadvertently negatively impacting smaller operations. My team has had great conversations with stakeholders in the committee on this issue, and I'm confident that we can come to a bipartisan consensus on the best way to move forward instead of trying to push through studies or new legislative changes right now. I think we need to continue this discussion, Republicans, Democrats, the Coast Guard, and our waterway operators to find the best way to protect our people at sea. Once we have the data on hand, I'm hoping to work with Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, as we move forward to a longer-term solution in the future. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and all that said, I will withdraw my amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Babin, and I'll commit to you that we'll continue to work on this.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Next, we have Mr. Auchincloss. You have an amendment?
Thank you, Chairman. I have an amendment 015 at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Auchincloss, number 015.
Without objection, we'll consider the amendment as read. And with that, Mr. Auchincloss, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're back at section 336 here. And I want to give the perspective of offshore wind on this. We've heard from the gentleman from Louisiana saying that offshore oil and gas will not be affected. That's community he represents. Happy to defer on that one. But I'm representing Massachusetts, which has the positioning to be a global leader in offshore wind development. And I'm here to assert that this section absolutely affects offshore wind development negatively. And offshore wind development is critical to meeting the Biden administration's climate goals, becoming energy independent, and creating good jobs. Ensuring the maximal amount of those jobs are done by U.S. workers is similarly important, and that is why I'm introducing an amendment that supports both objectives, a compromise. My amendment offers a compromise that keeps offshore wind viable and supports American mariners. First, it strikes Section 336 of the bill, and second, it inserts a prevailing wage requirement. I'm in favor of the intent of 336 to support American mariners, but its crewing requirements are not currently feasible. And for this reason, last Congress, a strong coalition of House Democrats, including our current minority leader, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, successfully called for that requirement to be removed entirely, and it did not become law despite the vote the gentleman from Louisiana previously mentioned. We should not ignore these legitimate concerns by including the same language again this year. Instead of ensuring jobs for American workers, this provision would halt offshore wind development and in turn prevent the creation of 83,000 American jobs, 83,000. This is because offshore wind construction requires highly specialized ships, including wind turbine installation vessels. In mandating these vessels meet certain flag and crew requirements, Section 336 fails to recognize that no existing wind turbine installation vessel would be compliant. And these vessels take a long time and a lot of money to build, too long and too much to hit the president's objective of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The provisions in Section 336 thereby sacrifice the entire offshore wind workforce by focusing on a small segment of the job market. Factoring in the full lifetime of an offshore wind project, more than 80% of all marine crew man-hours will be American mariners. Instead of jeopardizing those jobs, my amendment ensures that those American jobs remain by removing unworkable requirements, and it offers a pathway to 100% of the jobs being American. A prevailing wage requirement ensures that American mariners are not being passed up for jobs for which we have the ships and the workforce to perform. In parallel with this prevailing wage requirement, we must also invest in domestic shipbuilding for the highly specialized vessels utilized in offshore wind projects, and I'm working on follow-up legislation regarding surety bonds for shipbuilders for offshore wind. In closing, I'm offering a win-win compromise. My amendment supports offshore wind and good American jobs, both in the short and the long term. Supporting my amendment keeps us on track with the Biden administration's 30 gigawatts by 2030 climate agenda, while demanding offshore wind developers use American labor to the maximum extent. I urge the adoption of the amendment. I greatly appreciate the ranking member's previous comments in support, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Auchincloss. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I cannot support this amendment. It sets rulemaking requirements and enforcement obligations on the Coast Guard and on Homeland Security for which they have no expertise. With that, I yield back. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the gentleman if he could answer a couple of questions for me. My friend from Massachusetts. You game? Under your amendment, I want to understand, so you're trying to establish a prevailing wage. How under your amendment do you ensure compliance with that prevailing wage being paid?
The same way that we ensure compliance with prevailing wage requirements under federal law now, the same way that we've done so under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, under CHIPS and Science. The United States has well-tried and tested procedures for this.
So I'm reading your amendment, and in subsection B, it says, review of compliance. The secretary shall periodically, but not less than once annually, inspect each covered facility to verify the owner operator of the covered facility's compliance with the wage requirements. So it provides specific review authority, right?
And discretion to the enforcement.
Yeah, sure. And I'm just noting that you have explicit enforcement authority for prevailing wage. So another question. Under your amendment, you mentioned that you thought that this was going to help domestic workers. Is there anything in your amendment that would ensure that these companies are actually hiring domestic workers?
What does not help domestic workers is when we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. We have about 80,000 jobs at stake here for requirements that have not to do with the actual mariners themselves, but with access to the vessel.
So the answer is no. There's nothing that requires that this hire American workers. What it does, and I understand, you're trying to raise the wages, so that way there would be somewhat of an incentive to hire domestic folks. I get it. But where the amendment, it doesn't actually require that you hire American workers. You could go pay workers from other countries. Number two, where in here does it require that folks actually have TWIC certification as American workers would? Is that somewhere in the amendment? I didn't see it.
You're not doing offshore wind construction in the United States without complying with BOEM, with MARAD requirements for safety, for navigable waters. And furthermore, to your first point about the prevailing wage purpose here, is that it's meeting the intent, which is that we don't want American mariners passed over for lower paid foreign mariners. I hear that intent, we're meeting it, But what your amendment does, or your language, I should say, does is it prevents access to the 3 wind turbine installation vessels that currently exist in the entire world, and without which you cannot put a single turbine in the water.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman. I'm going to remind him of our conversations last year where we offered to grandfather in your projects, and my friend refused to come to the table. Let me clarify something that he said, reclaiming my time. Let me clarify something that I said a minute ago. This amendment does not require a TWIC card. It doesn't require that person have a TWIC card to work in the offshore waters. Number two, I would ask another question and ask, how many visas, how many foreign workers under this provision could be let into the United States? And I can answer the question. It's unlimited. There's no limitation whatsoever. We have a number of guest worker programs. We have H-2Bs, H-1As, agriculture, and other different types of guest worker programs. What those programs require is they require that you first advertise to ensure that they're not domestic workers to fulfill that job. And then only after you've been able to demonstrate that they're not domestic workers to fulfill the job, then you may go get a temporary visa for a temporary foreign guest worker. But under my friend's amendment, you don't have to do that. You can just go out, you can go hire Chinese people, you can go hire Iranians, you can go hire Russians, you can go anybody you want. And so I don't think that this is an American provision. I don't think it represents the right safety or security criteria that we need to be thinking about. And I'll say it again. This actually creates an incentive. It creates an incentive for foreigners to come in, because what you're doing is, yes, you're paying prevailing wage, but think about that for just a minute. If prevailing wage is 3 times what they pay in Mexico, you're going to have folks from Mexico all over the place coming here trying to compete for these jobs. So I understand my friend's intent. I think this amendment has gaping holes in it in regard to safety, in regard to, again, no TWIC, security, safety, and literally unlimited visas. And it doesn't even comply with existing requirements under guest worker programs in the United States. So I urge rejection of this amendment and yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
I urge the committee to vote no on this amendment by Mr. Auchincloss. I think we need to understand what the underlying bill actually does. What the bill does, it provides that any offshore vessel be crewed by men and women who are of the same nationality as the flag of the vessel. 1. Secondly, it ensures that offshore energy developers cannot abuse the B-1 special visa is currently available. Right now, an offshore developer, owner of a ship, can apply for hundreds of specialized B-1 visas, even though that ship could never, ever use all of those men and women that would have that visa. What it simply says is no more than 2.5 times the actual crewing that would be on that ship for B-1 visas. Secondly, the underlying bill that would be, these provisions would be wiped out by the proposed amendment, requires that the U.S. Coast Guard scrutinize proof of ownership and safety of the vessel. So the amendment wipes out that requirement of a safety inspection and ownership review by the Coast Guard. The amendment would wipe that out. It also requires that foreign mariners, Russians, Ukrainians, Chinese, Mexicans, whoever, undergo the security check that's required by all American mariners. This is the TWIC card, Transportation Worker Identification Credential. The proposed amendment by Mr. Auchincloss would wipe that out, and anybody from anywhere would be allowed to be on these vessels. Final point is that this amendment, no way, no how, despite Mr. Auchincloss's argument, harms the ongoing effort to build offshore wind industry. It doesn't do that. It simply requires that if there is a foreign vessel that is going to be used in that construction, that it meet these requirements. That's it. Now, the notion of a prevailing wage, I assume this is Mr. Auchincloss, specifically, are you referring to the prevailing wages as required under the Davis-Bacon? Yes or no?
Yes, at the discretion of the enforcing authority.
So the word prevailing wages is not, as we understand that word here, the Davis-Bacon prevailing wages. Keep that in mind, folks, particularly the Democrats. Apparently, the proposed amendment, while wiping out all of these protections, does not actually require the prevailing wage under the Davis-Bacon. It's some other prevailing wage, whatever that might be, and we have no idea what that is. There are multiple reasons, therefore, for us to reject the proposal. Now, I want to make it clear that there is one offshore energy project that is now under construction. This is in the Massachusetts area. The timing of this bill is such that that project will be completed before anything in this bill, including the underlying language of 336, would go into effect. So it does not affect that. Future projects, yes, they would be affected. Offshore vessels could be used, but they would be required to meet the certain requirements as I've already laid out. There are multiple reasons, therefore, to reject this amendment by Mr. Auchincloss, and I would urge a no vote.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Mr. Auchincloss for this amendment and working to bring a compromise to the table. We are entering an exciting time for offshore wind, and the President has the ambitious goal of achieving 30 gigawatts by 2030. I think the U.S. should have that goal. This amendment ensures that regardless of who's working in the development and maintenance of offshore energy, they're paid fair wages. And by leveling the playing field, we provide American mariners the opportunity to fairly compete for these jobs, to help ensure foreign workers, if they're working these jobs, are also paid fair wages. I understand there'll be members on our side of the aisle who have different views of that, and I appreciate that. We have to respect those differences, but I do support the development of offshore wind, support the use of American workers, and I believe this amendment can help us achieve both of those goals, and I support this amendment. Yeah, I yield back to the chair.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sorry, I just yielded back to the chair. I can, is that right? Yeah, I yield to the gentleman for a question, or what?
Thank you. Does the amendment strike all of the protections that I described?
Did you get an answer from that, from Mr. Auchincloss?
No, that's a question for you, sir.
Did you get an answer to that from Mr. Auchincloss when you asked him that?
Well, I've asked Mr. Auchincloss.
This is Davis-Bacon.
Does the amendment strike the protections that I described in my objection to your amendment?
It's Davis-Bacon prevailing wages. There is nothing in this amendment that can be construed to undermine well-established safety provisions for operating in any of the United States' exclusive economic zone.
So the answer is it does, in fact, eliminate all of the protections that I described.
With that, I will reclaim my time and yield back. Thanks.
Okay, recognize Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield the balance of my time to Representative Auchincloss.
Thank you to my friend from Washington. We've heard a lot of conjecture about foreign mariners, about safety standards, none of it with any basis in precedent or evidence about the ability of offshore wind developers to safely and productively get projects underway. Let me just be extremely clear what we are talking about here. The Biden administration has put forward as part of its ambitious climate agenda a goal to get to 30 gigawatts by 2030. That will not happen unless we can use the 3 wind turbine installation vessels that currently exist. None of those 3 are compliant with what's in this language. So a vote for this language is a vote to undermine the Biden climate agenda. We are working to get to a place where we have the domestic shipbuilding capability to meet WTIV demand. And like I said, I am working on legislation for surety bonds to help with domestic shipbuilders. But it is a simple math problem. These vessels cost $800 million in years and years to construct. We don't have them right now. We got 7 years to hit the president's goals. And this amendment is a compromise that says, yes, let's get to the president's goal. We believe in a clean energy transition. And let's also do it in a way that's paying prevailing wages so that American mariners are not, anytime we have the workforce and the ship available, the American mariners are never being passed over, and we can achieve a 100% American workforce in the near future. And I yield back. You've got to yield to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Mask, you recognized. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you. Let's be quite clear here. We all support, at least I support, offshore wind development. The underlying, the language in the bill as presented to us, Section 336, in no way, no how prevents foreign vessels from providing services to the offshore wind industry, whatever those vessels may be, and indeed there are specialized vessels. And by the way, some of those vessels are now being built in the American shipyards, specifically Philadelphia. The underlying bill does not stop any foreign vessel from being used in the construction of the offshore wind industry. What it does, however, is to require that that vessel be manned by individuals who are from the country in which the vessel is flagged, wherever that may be, Denmark, France, Mexico, wherever. Secondly, the underlying requirement is that the Coast Guard inspect that vessel and that it be safe. So it doesn't in any way stop the development. It requires that if those vessels are being used, they must be safely used and inspected. Secondly, that the men and women on those vessels be checked as every American mariner must be checked for national security reasons. Also, there is ample evidence today that these foreign vessels or foreign owners are using the B-1 visa exemption to an excess, requesting hundreds of visas for one ship that may only require 10 people on it. So we say limit it to 2.5 times the number of men and women that are actually going to be on that ship. So let me be clear here. Mr. Auchincloss is incorrect when he says this underlying language would stop it. It does not in any way stop a foreign vessel from being used, but if it is here, it must meet certain requirements. That's it. Nothing more. With that, I yield.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, yep, Mr. Bost.
Yes, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Graves, please.
Thank you, my friend from Illinois. Mr. Chairman, I want to follow along the lines of my friend, Mr. Garamendi from California, in just correcting some things. There were statements made that this isn't going to undercut U.S. vessels. Look, I've got examples right now, right here, where there was a vessel that was a Louisiana vessel that had a contract for 15 years delivering groceries to the offshore. It's been replaced with a Chinese vessel and a Chinese crew. We've got another vessel that was a Jones Act, U.S.-built crude flag vessel that then went and reflagged in the Marshall Islands, brought on a foreign crew, and is now doing work back in the United States. And then I think one of my absolute favorites, and see if I can at least hide where I got this from, a Chinese vessel that's actually being carried on a crane to avoid being placed in the water so it wouldn't have to comply with Jones Act rules. I mean, this goes on all the time right now. My friend was talking about WTIVs in Massachusetts. There aren't any there right now. There aren't. They're not there right now, but you know what is there? There are 2 foreign tugs operating in Massachusetts waters whenever, what do we have, 2,000 U.S. built, crewed, and flagged, 20,000 tugs in the United States. This absolutely undercuts. If anybody in this committee wants to work with us on ensuring that we have an American energy industry that is powered by American workers and giving our folks a level playing field, then I know if they're given a level playing field, Americans can outwork, we can outperform, we can out-innovate anyone, but we've got to be given a fair shot. Mr. Chairman, again, I just, the things that are being brought up in order to describe this amendment, they don't hold water. They don't. I mean, there are facts all over the place that show that what's being said is not the reality on the ground. We have the most mature offshore energy industry in the United States by far. We've witnessed how this plays out. We cannot give an advantage to foreign companies. I'll say it again. I urge rejection of this amendment. I yield back to my friend from Illinois.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Val?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Auchincloss, for working to bring this compromise language. I think it's close, and I understand the intent of the amendment, but I am concerned that there's no specific, explicit reference to prevailing wage. It says manning and accruing the covered facility, a minimum wage. And as a strong supporter of American workers, we need to make sure we're establishing high wage standards while also covering all maritime workers offshore and onshore, from mariners to the waterfront, all of those workers, and not exempt domestic operators. So I would encourage my colleagues to improve the language with regards to prevailing wages and work with labor to get that language right. It's close, but I would like to see those things explicit in this. And again, I understand your intent, but I'd like to see it written.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Would the gentlewoman be willing to yield 1 minute to me?
She already yielded her time back, but I'll let it slide.
Recognize Ms. Huffman.
Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to yield the gentleman.
There you
from
go.
Massachusetts
Thank you.
time.
So this amendment does reference prevailing wage in the U.S. Code. I mean, this is explicit, that we're talking about Davis-Bacon prevailing wage here. And I again just want to be extremely clear about the math here, because it is a very complicated subject, and yet really at the end of the day, the math is quite stark. To reach 30 gigawatts by 2030, to reach President Biden's goal, we need probably 7 wind turbine installation vessels. There are 3 in the world. They take 4 to 5 years to build, $700, $800 million. We're getting 1 underway right now, 1. We have more work to do to build more. We will not hit this goal if we do not allow these 3 WTIVs to be in compliance. And we are going to train the American workforce, and we're going to build the American ships to get there. But we have got to have an on-ramp to that objective. I yield back to the gentlewoman.
I thank the gentleman, and I just want to say I appreciate his clarification of his intent. I think looking at the language, there is still some remaining ambiguity, and I'm not the only one who sees it, as to whether this is a clear embrace of Davis-Bacon prevailing wage. Beyond that, I'm as strong a supporter of the Biden administration's climate goals as anyone you'll find. I have an offshore wind project in my district that I am hugely supportive of, but I am not at this point convinced that a provision like this is necessary for the success of the offshore wind project in my district or anywhere else. And so I'm happy to continue that conversation with the gentleman, but that at this point I will not be supporting the amendment.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on Auchincloss, amendment number 15. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying no. It appears the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested. As previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, all proceedings will be postponed on this amendment. Moving on, I recognize Mr. Bean.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, T&I Committee. Mr.
have
Chairman,
an
I have an
amendment
amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, offered by Mr. Bean of Florida, number 005.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Bean, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Next month will be National Tourism Appreciation Week, and for many states, tourism may be icing on your budget, but for Florida, it's the bulk of our economy. And right now, an important sector of our tourism economy is fighting for its very existence. And it stems from legislation passed last year. Specifically, the Small Passenger Vessel Act was added to the National Defense Authorization after the horrific overnight fire on the vessel, the Conception. New reforms and increased liability was needed, and it was passed. But it was, I think, designed to target overnight vessels, but instead it's captured dayboat operators, specifically the scuba diving industry. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for unanimous consent to submit the article from the National Law Review. It's an article titled, "You're Gonna Need a Bigger Boat," which crystallizes the difference between an overnight boat and a day boat, as well as telling everybody the true impact it's having on the small boat operators. I've got letters from mom and pops, in fact, one to Representative Brian Mast, an operator in his district that's struggling right now, because what's happened is these dive boats and even the stores that don't even have any boats are seeing increases of their liability insurance, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000. Just the increases, not their cost, of what's happening based on this new legislation. So the amendment today just says there's a difference between overnight boats and day boats. And when you support this amendment, members, you're supporting jobs and mom and pops and just a clean, wholesome industry, as well as helping my state, possibly your state, deal with the challenges of being a small business. That is the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
You asked unanimous consent without objection. That is so ordered. Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Larson.
I'll speak first. I'll just say that last Congress, we passed legislation in a bipartisan manner to address the liability associated with small passenger vessels. And prior to that, that liability was limited to the value of the vessel. Often that resulted in little to no recovery for victims. This legislation, the legislation this amendment seeks to amend, which is only enacted in December, aligns vessel liability with common requirements. But the amendment would limit liability for a section of the industry with no data to support the change. The fact that it was included in the National Defense Bill indicated that there was strong bipartisan support to get this bill done, because nothing gets in the NDAA at the end of the year without broad bipartisan agreement. And we've just passed that. And I would just note that I don't want to be too harsh, but this is like telling surviving family members that because their family happened to be on a vessel that didn't have bedrooms, that the lives of their loved ones were somehow worth less. And we went through a lot to get to the point we got to last year to get this fix in the NDA, and I hope we can keep it there. And so I'd urge my colleagues to vote no.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment. In 2019, the Conception boat fire in my district took the lives of 34 passengers. Should a tragic event like this ever happen again, their families deserve compensation. Last Congress, this committee passed and Congress enacted my bill, the Small Passenger Vessel Liability Fairness Act. That law updated antiquated laws from the 1800s that allow maritime accident victims and their families to receive just compensation. This amendment would remove day boats from these requirements and lower the time frames victims have to bring a civil case. This would stymie the ability of families to recoup damages in the unfortunate event of a tragedy. I held a hearing in my district to ensure that another Conception boat tragedy wouldn't happen. I'm not willing to look at the next group of families suffering such a loss in the eye with no explanation for why the law would value the lives of their loved ones any less. I strongly urge you to vote no on this amendment. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the?
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Bean.
Mr. Bean?
Thank you, Mr. James. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a way to protect small boat operators and keep the reforms that were designated for the overnight vessels. But if we don't make a change, let's be clear, we are killing the scuba diving industry. I know in Florida, and if you have any state with coastline, there's probably a scuba diving operator that's struggling right now. So there is a way to go forward. I've got good news, committee. The good news is the chairman has realized that this issue is worthy of consideration of moving on to the advanced bill. And so today, because he has said, Bean, bring the issue up, withdraw it, and then I'm going to give you full consideration as the final bill product comes out, I ask for unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection? So ordered. Thank you, Mr. Bean. I appreciate that and look forward to working with you further on this.
Mr. Chair, I yield the balance of my time.
You want it?
I'd like to say something.
Oh, on the amendment?
Yes.
He withdrew it, but that's fine. Ms. Brownlee?
I just wanted to say that I do not support any kind of blanket liability exemptions for any boat owners, but would certainly like to work with you in a bipartisan way to see if we can find a solution. With that, I yield.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Thank you. Thank you. Moving on, Mr. Collins, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm 108 days into this new venture.
Just call up your amendment and we'll designate.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's amendment.
You have an amendment at the desk?
Yes, sir.
Please designate the amendment.
It's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741. It strikes section 312 of the bill.
Clerk, designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741 offered by Mr. Collins, number 004.
Okay, with that, without objection, we'll consider the amendment as read. It has been distributed. Mr. Collins, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about that. I guess y'all can tell I've only been here 108 days, too. And this is my first time ever being elected, so first time offering an amendment. I would like to say, though, you know, I came up here with a purpose. We've got a $31 trillion debt that we must address. We've got authorizations up here that we must attend to and make sure, especially in a case like this. This is the Coast Guard. These are men and women that are out there putting their lives on the line to keep us safe and to protect our country. And I know how serious that is. And I know how serious the situation is and how important it is that we support them in every capacity. But as I have sat in hearing after hearing after hearing, it seems that we have had a focus from every agency up here that has gotten off their mission to do their job and to become more of a social experiment, more of going to some social left-wing ideology. And we're renaming things to rename things. And we're not taking care of the job at hand, and that is providing these people the tools they need to protect our country. That's why I rise and I'd like to see this seamen left alone and not be changed to seafarers. I've talked with leadership here, and I've been told that we will work on this to get this straightened out before it gets to the floor. I'd love to be a part of that. I'd love to hear that that's what we're going to do. And Mr. Chairman, with that in hand, I will withdraw my amendment today. And I yield back.
I appreciate withdrawing the amendment. As I told you, we can try. I hate to make this bill about this. And the Coast Guard's been using that term for a decade, but I will try to work with you. Mr. Larson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just note there are at least 6 other sections of 46 USC that use the term seafarers, and my understanding is this is just one section they're trying to make consistent with what already exists in law, and it's really nothing more than that. And appreciate the gentleman making the note about the important work the Coast Guard does, because most of what we have to do in the Coast Guard authorization is supporting the Coast Guard in that critical national security work, and he's right on that. And sometimes we also have to do kind of the boring technical cleanup work on the law as well, and that's just how I read that particular section that he seeks to change. So if there's a way to move forward on this in the future, or want to certainly be part of that and look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Absolutely, and I commit to that. So thank you, Mr. Collins. At this point, we are going to have a very short recess simply to get our members here who are in other markups. We have 3 roll calls and then final passage to dispense with. So as it stands, we'll stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair. This is going to be a quick recess, so don't go anywhere.
Roughly, don't go far.
bring the committee back to order. So the committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 2741, and now the question is on the amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, previously postponed. So first, Amendment 104, offered by Mr. Perry, to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, on which a recorded vote was ordered. Is a recorded vote still requested? Yes? Yes? Recorded vote is still requested. So with that, the clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson.
No.
Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry.
Yes.
Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin.
No.
Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. No. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. No. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. No. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. No. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost.
No.
Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. I'm sorry, Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
No.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Payne. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
No.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. Desagne. Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Stauber. No. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
No.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. No. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew.
No.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels.
No.
Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. No. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Pappas. No. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann.
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yacom. Mr. Yacom votes no. Ms. Strickland. No. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez DeReamer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards.
No.
Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan.
No.
Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito.
No.
Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Burleson.
Aye.
Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James.
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes.
No.
Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Ms. Skolton.
No.
Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins.
Yes.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell.
No.
Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte.
No.
Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes no.
Please call the names of those who didn't respond.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Mast. Mr. Payne. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mrs. Chavez DeReamer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Van Orden.
How's Mr. Good recorded?
I'm sorry, who, sir?
Mr. Good? Good.
Mr. Gooden is not recorded. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Seeing none, please announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 4 ayes and 53 noes.
The amendment is agreed to. Or not agreed to, I apologize. The amendment is not agreed to by a huge margin, by the way. Yeah. I tried to help, Mr. Perry. I tried to help. Next, the amendment offered by Mr. Perry, number 121, in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, which a recorded vote was recorded, or I mean a recorded vote was requested. Is a recorded vote still requested? Yes, it is. Please call the names.
Chairman
Call the
Graves.
vote. No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson.
No.
Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost.
No.
Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
No.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
No.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. Desailly. Mr. Desailly votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
No.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yacom.
No.
Mr. Yacom votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer.
No.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards.
No.
Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito.
No.
Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Burleson.
No.
Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James.
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes.
No.
Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Ms. Skolton.
No.
Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell.
No.
Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes no.
How is Massey recorded?
I'm sorry, once again?
How is Massey recorded?
Mr. Massey is not recorded.
Massey votes yes.
Mr. Massey votes aye.
Please call the absentees. Call the absentees.
Mr. Payne. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Menendez. And Mr. Van Orden.
Okay. Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Seeing none, please announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 2 ayes and 58 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Next, we have the amendment number 15 offered by Mr. Auchincloss of Massachusetts to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741, in which a recorded vote was ordered. Is a recorded vote still requested? Yes, it is. Recorded vote is still requested, so the clerk please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford. No. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey.
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
How did the ranking member vote?
The ranking member voted aye.
Ranking member voted aye. I vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. No. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost.
No.
Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida?
No.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne? Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon? Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Stauber? No. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas? Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas? Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann? Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss? Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum?
No.
Mr. Yakum votes no. Ms. Strickland? Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer?
No.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Edwards?
No.
Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey?
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito?
No.
Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon?
Present.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes present. Mr. James?
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes? Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden? Ms. Skolton? Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York? Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi? Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro? Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell?
No.
Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte? Mr. Duarte votes no. And Mr. Bean of Florida? Mr. Bean of Florida votes no.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Payne? Mr. Burchett? Mr. Carter of Louisiana? And Mr. Van Orden?
Have all members been recorded that wish to be recorded? Hearing none, clerk, please announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 6 ayes and 54 noes.
Thank you very much.
And 1 present.
The amendment is not agreed to. All right, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2741 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 2741 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it, and there is a recorded vote. I am
Mr. Chairman, I
requesting.
request a recorded vote.
There we go. So with that, a recorded vote has been requested. Please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson.
Aye.
Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Yes.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Yes.
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Aye.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast.
Yeah.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mrs. Gonzalez Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mr. DeSagne. Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yacom.
Yes.
Mr. Yacom votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer.
Aye.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
Yes.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
Aye.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James.
Aye.
Mr. James votes aye. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Williams of New York votes aye. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins.
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell.
Yes.
Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, how was I recorded, Babin?
Mr. Babin is recorded as no.
I'll make that a yes. Sorry about that.
Mr. Babin is recorded as having voted yes.
Thank you.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Payne. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Van Orden.
Have all members been recorded or wish to be recorded? Hearing none, clerk, please announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 58 ayes and 3 noes.
I voted 58 ayes and 3 noes. The bill is favorably. Did she have somebody? Who? Yep, we haven't announced it yet, or I haven't called it yet. We already had it. How is he recorded?
Mr. Kane of New Jersey is recorded as aye.
Okay. So announce the vote one more time.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 58 ayes and 3 noes.
58 ayes and 3 noes. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. With that, before I finish, I want to recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 brief things. One is, I know members are busy and we are double booked at times, and there were members who were stuck in Homeland Security on our side of the aisle, and you did as much as you could to accommodate their schedules to get over here. They weren't able to do that. I also understand that that was not an issue with us, but perhaps an issue with Homeland Security, and I hope that we can sand off those rough edges in the future to ensure our members can get here in order to do the vote. So I just want to be sure that that's in the record. The second is, I just want to congratulate you on this first big, long markup for this committee. It's a great example of what we can do when we work together, when our staffs work together and get a bipartisan bill out of this committee, and look forward to the floor sometime in the future. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I completely agree with your assessment of the scheduling and the problems we had with Homeland Security, and we're going to work on that to address it. With that, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted without objection. That is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measures ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bill to be subjected to the Budget Act or a Rule 21 cut-go point of order. Without objection, that is also so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for all actions taken on all committee business today. And with that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed the business. Thanks, everyone. This is adjourned.